So what is a way of thinking about software and process that organizations are using where they are rapidly getting to those good business outcomes, where they can not only deploy software every week, but also start to use that tool, use kind of the tools that DevOps gives them and the abilities that DevOps gets them to have much better software that allows the end users, the customers, to interact better with the businesses that they have and hopefully satisfy the goals that their organizations have. So that's where this notion of it has all sorts of names. I call it design or just software that isn't terrible. But I like to use the idea of user-centric software, which is if your software is going to be used by people, I suppose there's a large amount of that's not used by people. It's used by other machines or something like that. And so maybe there's machine software. But when you have this idea of software used by a person, if you've worked on software for a while, you realize that it's really hard to predict the best way to implement a feature or write your software that will solve a user's problem. It's really an exploratory process that you have where you generally know the problem that you're going to solve, but sometimes that's not the case as well. You don't even know the problem that you're going to solve well, but you generally have an idea of what your user wants to do. You know, they might want to pay a bill, or you might have your field workers who are being fair power lines or home internet connections. You might have some software that's assigning them which work to go to. But knowing how exactly to write that software and how exactly to solve their problem is always a difficult notion that you have. And we see this constantly, or at least I see it in software that I use. That the development team or the product team has implemented a feature in the software doesn't exactly match to the way that I want to use it. And I end up having to spend a lot of time thinking about how the software works and then changing away the way that I operate to work with the software well. And I'll get to an example of this right after going over this next point, which is the general process and way of thinking that I see large organizations use when they want to be more user-centric in how they're doing software. So this is a very oversimplified, to make it easy to explain, instance of this. But whenever you encounter an unknown situation, a problem that you need to solve, I think this general loop is over the centuries what humans, maybe other animals use this, but I'm no biologist, but that humans have used. The idea here is that you have an unknown problem in front of you, and to use a very disciplined, structured way to solve that problem, you come up with a theory or a hypothesis of what that problem may be. So again, I'll go over an example after this briefly. And then you think of a way, how would I validate if my theory of how to solve the problem was true or not? And in software, the way that you validate that is, one, you write software, and two, you sort of run the experiment. You put it in front of actual end users, and you see if it solves their problems in the parameters that you have. And that putting it in front of end users, you can probably start to think is of a huge part of where this value that something like DevOps brings you, where you can deploy your software every week or every day. And it allows you to observe if the way your theory solves their problems. And then based on that, if it didn't solve their problems, you can try to solve it another way. And if it did solve their problem, then congratulations, here's another problem you can solve. And so this way of chipping away at discovering, solving that problem, this kind of small batch loop is what you see organizations using who are successful at improving their software function. Now, this has all sorts of names. I'm just stealing this from all sorts of people. There's the lean startup idea that has this loop in it. There's a whole bunch of applying lean startup to lean enterprise thinking. In actual lean manufacturing, there's the plan, do, check, act, or PDCA loop. And also, people in this area seem to love the sort of U.S. Air Force's idea made by this guy Colonel Boyd of the OODA loop, or the OODA loop, which is something that they teach fighter pilots to evaluate a situation, decide what to do, and act, and constantly be responding to the changing business environment in the skies, if you will. So, what's an example of putting this loop into place? How does having a weekly or a daily loop that allows you to do this improve the software that you have? So I'll give you an example here based on the IRS. If you're not familiar with them, up here in the U.S., it's the tax collection agency that we have. You can imagine perhaps the sarcastically put most beloved government organization that we get to interact with up here. So when people don't pay their taxes on time, which is, I guess, an unfortunate situation for everyone involved, you're delinquent in your taxes. And the way the IRS notifies you, so to speak, of that is every single day they increase the penalty that you owe on your taxes. So people are highly motivated to find out on that day how much taxes they owe so that they can pay that off so that the next day they don't owe more taxes. Now, for a long time, the way the IRS solved this problem is they had a call center. You would pick up the telephone and call someone, we'll call the IRS, and there was a call center manned by people who would look up on their machine, and I imagine there was some green screen application that they were madly typing away in, like a gate agent at the airport does, and they would look up how much you owed so that you could pay it off then. Now, of course, call centers are relatively expensive compared to not having one, and instead having software, for example. And also, we up here in the U.S., it's not like we like to sufficiently fund the IRS. So their budget is always shrinking and they need to optimize costs. And as a consequence, there was a study that said the calls were only actually answered about 37% of the time when you would call into the IRS. And what this meant, to put it another way, that's more of an IT way, is that there was only 37% uptime. And so I would imagine in your job, if you only had 37% availability for your applications, you would probably not be working at your organization anymore. That would be a terrible failure. So for all these reasons, the IRS thought what we should do is we should solve this problem by having some software. Now, traditionally, the way that most organizations, and especially government organizations, our US government organizations would work, is they would write up a huge amount of documents. They would probably source it out to someone else to do. And then maybe 2 or 3 years later, they would launch the software and they would have their piece of software that was trying to solve the problem. And if you think back to this idea of solving software is a series of solving unknown problems, they would have had to take a huge gamble on their idea of how to solve it. And indeed, because they were following a small batch process, they could kind of watch themselves discover this every week as they came up with a new theory and changed it and tweaked it. But their first idea of how they solved it, and you can see that on the left side, put in orange the thing you're supposed to find, just so you can cheat. But they would show a complete financial history of someone's use of the software. And people will get lost in all of this information, and they would want to pick up the phone and call them. So this would have been, after a couple of years, a complete failure of the system, right? They wouldn't have solved the person's problems. But because they were following the small batch process, they were able to observe how people were using the software, how it was failing, and completely hone it and get to the situation afterwards, which sounds ridiculous when you go over it. But it turns out when you know how much money you owe the IRS, all you want to know is how much money you owe the IRS, which is the UI that they presented to them. And then people would not want to pick up the phone, and they would actually pay their taxes off there. So what they found after deploying this is there were 2 million users who started using this, which is a bit distressing. That means 2 million people weren't. So perhaps we should go back to our civics class and tell them they should pay their taxes if they like all their highways and other government services. And they brought in almost $500 million of taxes with it, right? So it's a great success in applying a more user-centric way of doing software. Now, I go over this at length. It's a very simple example of this, but it shows the importance and the success of putting that small batch process in place, of benefiting from all the benefits that you get from DevOps, the results you get from DevOps, put a weekly software release cadence in effect. And also, I think, shows the point that just because you can release your software weekly, that's only half of the story. The other half is actually putting a user-centric process in place to improve the software that you have. So how are large organizations getting to this point where they actually have the technology in place to release their software weekly, but also are able to have a user-centric design way of putting their software in production? How do they change the culture as you would hear about? Well, what I see in large organizations is it starts and sort of ends, if you will, with the management layer. So if you have one, two, or maybe even five teams of developers, it's very easy to change how your organization does software. But if you think about the scale of regular large organizations, right? There's someone like a JP Morgan Chase has anywhere between 19 and 25,000 developers, depending on how you count them. And changing over how all those developers and the product managers do software is incredibly hard. And that, at that kind of scale, is really the job of management. And just as we expect developers and operations and designers to change over how they are doing their jobs day to day and week to week, the job of management changes over quite a lot as well. So for what I see is organizations still when it comes to management and leadership need to do the same things of figuring out what the strategy is, what are the goals that they have, what are the kind of business notions that they have, right? Like, so for example, in many different countries, a lot of the strategy that banking has is we would like to have mobile payments. There are a lot of people who don't have bank accounts at all, sort of purely cash-oriented people. And our vision and our strategy is that we would like to start selling products to these people who don't use banking. And so we need to go out, write some software, and figure out how we get them involved in banking in a way that works with what their daily sort of cash workflow is. And I was just in Indonesia a few weeks ago, and this is definitely a huge thing that motivates banking there, and many other countries as well. So someone needs to establish that as the vision and the strategy. But things sort of rapidly change there from what management typically does. And as we'll get into, you'll be changing your organization structure. When you have, as you have in a DevOps team, all these roles on the same team, the way that you compensate people and the human resources plans that they operate under, all of these things start to change from the old way of doing things to more support the new way of doing things, right? Because the tool that management has to motivate staff is there's a bit of visionistic motivation that they can give them. But at the end of the day, or more likely at the end of the year, the only tool that management has to change how people operate is how they compensate them and the policy that they operate under. And so management needs to, for example, go work with HR and change how people's careers are managed based on the new way they want them to operate and how they're paid and how their bonuses are done, which again is not something that an individual team can do very well. It's management's job to do that as well. And then, as I'll get to at the end, management also has a huge job to do with other managers and other leadership in the company to not only argue for budget for this change and sort of cover for it, but to start to scale that change to a larger organization and convince the rest of the organization to change how they're doing things as well. Now, I go over all of this because, again, it's very easy in a DevOps world to get obsessed with your automation and even your monitoring and sort of culture in a team. But if you're working in a large organization, it's very important, especially as an individual staff person, to see if management is changing as well. And if management isn't changing the way that it's doing things, you probably are not going to be too successful as an organization at transforming. And you'll sort of end up at the same place you were, just with different posters on the wall and different books on your bookshelf than you had at the end. But you'll still have those sad posters in the corner. So as mentioned, one of the first things that management I see in successful organizations change is how they're organized quickly. And I'm sure if you've heard any sort of DevOps talk, you've heard about silos versus unified teams. I mean, it's sort of right there in the idea of DevOps that you're bringing together developers and operations people. But I still see this at pretty much every large organization I talk with who hasn't yet transformed, is that the IT department is arranged around a functional organization, or silos, to use the jargon of the DevOps world. And, I haven't gone to go look this up, but I think at some point it was the optimized way as far as efficiency, risk management, and maybe cost controls to arrange, where you had, your enterprise architects in one group, your security people in another group, the infrastructure managers in a group, the application development people in their own group, and the database people and the networking. And I assume that was a great way of operating, where you would sort of check out these people like a library. But what people have been finding to improve the way their software is done is if you're releasing your software every week or every day, I mean, it will take you a week just to schedule meetings with all these various people, with your enterprise architects or your DBAs to do your databases. It takes a long time to coordinate across these different silos, and that just eats up a lot of your time. Now, of course, this isn't to mention the more cynical problems of, and this goes back to why management is important, is each of these silos is differently compensated and differently motivated about what their job is, right? So DBA people, it's important for them to keep databases in a good state and to maintain whatever referential integrity is. And so they're not always too interested in rapidly changing things like your application developers may be. And so the incentives aren't aligned across these silos. And over the years and over the decades, they tend to be battling with each other and cause all sorts of issues. So what I see in successful organizations who are improving how they do their software is they arrange in these more what I would call kind of a product team oriented way. So they bring together not only all the roles, but the people needed to support an application or a service into one team. And these teams tend to be a small amount of people, 4 to maybe 12 to at most 16 people. And they tend to be developers and the designers that you made, product managers, operations skilled people, and sometimes depending on the product that you're working on, the software you're working on, you might have specialists like a data scientist if it's a data heavy thing or something like that. And there is still sort of this idea of maybe there's a role or some skills you only need for like a week, and they tend to get sort of checked out to those teams, like a library, not like someone not paying attention to their work. But you have these teams who are dedicated only to the software that they're working on, and they work on it for a long term. And this is just what we do in the software industry, is we don't have all these different roles not working with each other. We have, because we're developing a product, that's the way that we generate our revenue, sort of the most important thing that we're doing. I guess other than sales, of course. Sales is always important if you're looking to make money with software. But we have these dedicated teams of all the roles that you need working on the software. So this is taken from a great talk that Cornelia did that kind of goes over this more in depth. But this is the first thing that management is always faced with across companies I've worked with, like Duke Energy, Allstate, Humana, all these various large organizations that are fixing how they do software, is they reorganize people into these product teams that are fully dedicated to the product that they have. So the next logical question is, what do these product teams look like? And what are the things they're doing? So as mentioned, these teams work with each other, everyone on a weekly basis, right? They don't just see their product manager every few months to hear what their requirements and the features are. They don't just talk with QA people, at the end of a release cycle. They actually are working together every day, thinking about the exact release that they're working on, how users use software, and getting increasingly familiar with it. And as pictured here, they often have these exciting open areas, and as we'll get into, they're often pairing together and they're working together in a very concerted way to solve their problems. And inexplicably, there's always lots of sticky notes involved. So that's something you can look forward to. Tell your office facilities people you need to order some boxes of sticky notes, because apparently you'll be using lots of those. But when you look at the skills that developers have, the first thing that I think is very important to look at is, if we're looking to do software the best way possible, are we actually following best software processes out there as far as developing the software, testing it, deploying it, and managing the whole life cycle of software? And this may seem like a sort of pedantic or basic thing to suggest, but when you look at surveys like this one, what you find is that most organizations, or a surprisingly large amount of organizations, are not actually following the best practices that we've developed over the last quarter of a century. So this survey it's a bit dated. It's last year's survey that Gartner does of agile practices in place. And if you look at the blue lines, this is the percentage of survey respondents who doing these processes at the time of the survey. Now, of course, the green says we're planning on doing these processes, which I always take to mean we're never going to actually do these processes. They're just sort of stuck in that planning PowerPoint that someone uploads to their SharePoint site somewhere, and then they're done with that. They don't actually need to make sure they implement them. Maybe I worked a little too cynical. But if you look at this, you can see that things drop off very quickly as far as best practices that you would be following if you're doing software well. So even if you may have, as organizations are fond of telling me, just certified 500 or 1,000 Scrum Masters, and therefore you must be assured that you're doing these agile practices. It's really good if you're on a team yourself or you're one of these management people who's trying to transform to actually go out and assess if you're following these practices, because the chances are high that there's at least some teams in your group that are not following practices. So the next thing that the teams do, and I made a joke about sticky notes, is if you're following the small batch process, right? Like every week, you're putting some new features into production. And more so, you're not just incrementally solving some big stack of requirements that you had, but you're studying, if not, what features you're going to put into, you're going to work on and release next week is going to be more fluid than if you had one of these large 3-ring binders that you can just sort of plan out in a sort of a time-marched way of doing things. And so this doesn't mean that you're completely ignorant about what you're going to do in a month. Again, like I was saying, you generally know the problem that you're solving, right? Like we know that we'll probably be, if we're the IRS, retrieving people's information about the taxes they owe. So at some point, we're going to make a service that interacts with that system. And we're going to have to present that UI. So we're going to need a UI that presents the financial information that they have. But what I see organizations avoiding is on the left there, that large, and nowadays I suppose it's emailed instead of printed out, that large 3-ring binder that has 5-level deep subsections that are numbered, going over what the what a print screen looks like for your historic bills and exactly detailing what that looks like. And instead, they have oftentimes, whether it's digital, if you will, in sort of some online Kanban board, a backlog manager, whether it's like something like Pivotal Tracker or Trello or whatever Atlassian products you might use, they tend to have essentially Post-it note sized ideas of what a story or a feature is. And they manage them a lot more fluidly, and they evolve over time. And they take this much more, I guess literally agile approach to it. So this has great benefits for enabling that small batch process. But as this quote from someone at the US Air Force goes over, it also is a really interesting way of doing risk management, right? So if you think about that IRS case, if they had delivered that software at the end of a year to be charitable or 2 years, and it didn't solve the problem, they would have spent a tremendous amount of money and not solved the problem, right? So that's a huge amount of risk that they were taking on that could have been maybe not career ending, but wouldn't have improved the reputation of the IRS. And instead, if you're able to adjust, let's say on a monthly basis, what you're doing, you can manage your risk much better, because you have 12 windows, as depending on what months you take off of vacation, but you have many opportunities during the year to change what it is you are doing and better manage that risk. And there's also some budgetary interesting ways that you can do gated funding to control the budget that you have. But overall, organizations are finding that this small batch way of doing requirements management is a much improved way of doing things. So again, this is not only a piece of advice learned from high-performing organizations, but a way that you can investigate if your organization is actually improving the way they're doing things. If you're still emailing around and figuring out how to attach to OneDrive or your SharePoint site or Dropbox or G Drive or whatever you use, some gigantic Word document that details the next 2 years of features, you probably need to go improve that process and stop doing that, because it's probably indicative that you're not following the best processes out there. So then when you look at what the teams actually do, these product teams, right? So again, as just to emphasize it, you tend to have all the roles that you need on that team, right? And all of them focus on each release cycle, and at the beginning of larger chunks of release cycles, what are the features that we're going to be working on? Let's make sure everyone knows, down to the developer, to an architect, to an operations person, who the people are that are our customers and our users. Let's all go through the process of selecting things that we have. Let's all start to think more in a test-driven way, from developer to operations people. And definitely, we need to have an automated build pipeline and continuous delivery pipeline in place, which I find that many organizations overlook. They think that because they have a continuous integration, a way of automating builds, they're sort of done. But they miss the bigger picture of having an actual build pipeline that automates not only building and testing, but packaging and setting up configuration, all the way to automatically being able to deploy to production if they wanted to. And these are, aside from the one in the upper right-hand corner, pictures of teams at actual regular organizations doing this. And again, I think it's valuable to get a notion that you don't have to be one of these startups to do this. You can be people who actually wear button-up shirts and tuck them and wear polo shirts, not just startup people in their Thor and Iron Man t-shirts and flip-flops who do it. Everyone else can participate as well. So one practice that I like to pull out in particular, and this is a screenshot from a video going over how Volkswagen does this, which is fun to look at if you want to hear some German, which is a delightful language. Is that I see large organizations who are successful with this. They think about doing rotated pairing, and so you might remember from your extreme programming reading that there is this program where two developers sit with each other and they both look at the same screen and they write code and run tests. And this seems a little nutty at first, like you're going to have your productivity and double your costs, but it's become apparent that paired programming increases the quality and the knowledge sharing and actually the velocity that teams have because you have two people working on this. But you also see pairing being used across all the roles for product managers, designers, operations people, and the same benefits of having higher quality software or work product, like with designers, sharing knowledge and getting a better sense of how everything is working in the system occurs when you pair up on those other roles. So that is something that I see teams doing that is very successful in these organizations, is they kind of get over the weird accounting notions of this and they pair up people, which, as I'll get into in the last part, is also a great way to scale up this change. Trainers, if you will, who then go to other teams and pair with people and train these new people how to do their work. Then I've gone this whole way, even though I ostensibly said this is not really a DevOps talk. I'm not talking about DevOps or the exciting part of release management and automation. And I think the story of DevOps, as told in my head by myself, is essentially the story of breaking down this idea, the wall of confusion, as I think coined by my friend and now boss, Andrew Schaefer, that developers were very good at some point in the 2000s at doing a monthly scrummish kind of release. Every 30 days, they could have a golden release or whatever that's called when you don't actually have a DVD or a CD-ROM printed. And this software could be released. But going back to that functional organization thing, the job of operations was to keep production up. And if they knew anything, it was that every time they deploy the developer's release, production comes down. So a smart person who needs to pay their mortgage or their rent or their kids' schooling or things, they would realize if they wanted to be paid well, they should just never release software, which is, of course, ridiculous, but they can also go back to releasing software as little as possible. So obviously, if you want to deploy to users every week and observe the software, this is not going to be a tenable way to run your organization. So a lot of what came about doing DevOps came from this idea of how do we break that team down? And to summarize a great deal of work, and finally, I think in the past 2 years, there's a very detailed way of thinking about what are the practices of DevOps, how do we switch people over, how do we want to, not make, but how do we move people over to wanting to work together. There's a great book out by the DevOps Report people called Accelerate, which is kind of the 300-page version of the annual DevOps report. That's definitely well worth looking into if you're interested in all the details. But how do we get people to work together? And my way of summarizing it is that we treat the entire process of software like software development. And we also have an idea of what operations looks like. So we have developers be more cognizant of and be more responsible for how things are running in production, right? How they should actually be aware of the issues that come up and write their software to run well in production, which again sounds ridiculous, but I remember when I was the developer, that wasn't really one of our priorities. That was someone else's problem. But then also equally, the operations people should start treating production like development itself. And not only doing something which seems crazy but obvious, like checking configuration in, but they take on this site reliability engineer or SRE idea of we should automate or program everything as much as possible, and doing anything manually is a bad idea. And so you reset these priorities, and you think about your software development cycle as being every single part of the software life cycle, including running it. And again, a lot of the details of this are written up very well nowadays. But that's a lot of what I think DevOps is addressing, is not just having these two separate roles, thinking about how they solve their own problems, and therefore slowing down that release cycle, and therefore meaning that you can't have a small batch process in place. So in response to that, what you end up seeing very frequently is that organizations end up building platforms, as I like to think of them. And we did a white paper at Pivotal, and you can guess what the conclusion is of how you satisfy this need, which I'll let you go into and look at yourself if you want to. But if you look at all of the functionality need when you take this larger view of software and looking at the full picture, you can find all the different services and components that you need to pay attention to as a team and as the platform operations people supporting it. So you not only pay attention to things like putting a build pipeline in place, worrying about your middleware and how you package up software, but of course you pay attention to security, and of course you pay attention to the way that you're monitoring and doing things. Because again, as the product team, all of this is what you care about in software, right? You don't only care about generating that build if you're the development team, and if you're an operations person, you don't only care about isolating what this buggy software is and then rolling back the software. You all care about the full picture. So because no one person or team of people can actually manage all of this, you create or you acquire a platform that automates a tremendous amount of this. And as you look across all of this, you want to think about, how do I automate this and make many of these components something that I don't have to worry about, right? I want to worry every week when I do a release cycle, I only want to worry about the software that I have, not worry about how I set up SSL certificates or how I make sure that our firewall and load balance, and have some other system worry about that for me, which is what you see in the larger organizations who are successful at applying DevOps, and definitely all of the big name tech companies that we would think about, right? Like when as happened recently, when a new version of Gmail comes out, it's not like the product team working on it thinks about all of these small issues of deployment and configuration and things like that. As well documented, there's an internal platform at Google and at Netflix and all these other places, and also at those companies that I was highlighting, like Allstate and Liberty Mutual, and at the Air Force, and all sorts of other organizations that are taking care of this for you instead of having development teams worry about it themselves. So, just briefly, we have a way of solving that problem. There you go. There's my only way of getting paid today. You can check that out if you're interested. So when you get to this point, to using a platform, deploying their software, getting into that virtuous cycle of using a small batch process. In a large organization, what counts is not just doing 1, 2, or 5 teams like I was, but how do we change over the entire organization to improve how they're doing software? And again, this is what I'm most interested in and what I've studied, because I've worked in large organizations, and the frustration is always, how do we change everyone over to doing that? So it's still early on. I would say we're only like 3, at most 4 years into this, which seems like a long time, but in the grand scheme of 10 to 15 years to change over how organizations operate is just the beginning. There's a couple of observations and sort of cases that I've encountered that go over how organizations are scaling. And if you want to look up this presentation, there's one interesting presentation from FedEx of how they're integrating their sort of startup-y way of doing things back into the main line, and how they continuously kind of check in and change over how they're doing things. And they've got this wonderful hand-drawn illustration, which I love to use here. But to extract some of the principles, and again, this goes back to why management is so important and why leadership is important. How I see organizations starting off, which is critical, is they start off smaller than you would think. So they start off with a small group of applications. And as illustrated there on the left, they slowly scale up to more and more applications. So this is important, because when it comes to change management in a large organization, the first thing that you're battling against is other parts of the organization saying that you're using a poor methodology, and therefore, because it's failed early on, you should not try to do it, right? Like, unfortunately, in many large organizations, there's this sort of zero-sum competition where everyone's battling for resources. And if you are in one part of the org and you're trying to change how you're doing things, rival parts of the organization may see that as attracting more budget and more attention away from them. And so therefore, they're on the lookout for you failing very early. And they'll use that, again, very unfortunately, as a tool to say why they should be getting those resources and you should be getting less. So this is a precarious situation to be in when you're trying to try something new, because you're going to screw it up and fail at it. Or to use a synonym, you're going to be learning how to do things in a new way. So you want to choose small applications that won't cause big failure that will kill your initiative early on. Now, on the other hand, you want to choose real applications that aren't just like conference room scheduling applications or things like that. Because as you work on these applications, you're also going to be building up a bunch of success cases that you'll use to argue your point that you should be given more resources and more scope, and so that you can use to win over the organization for it. And so that's what the example on the left shows, is over about the first year, how Home Depot, the large hardware retailer, picked a series of small applications, and as they learned how to do things in this new way and switched teams over and had success, they ramped up the number of applications that they had more and more and more. So for example, one of the applications they picked early on was the software used to drive the paint desk in their store, matching custom paint for people who would come in instead of just off paint. And that was a real business, but it was a small enough business that as they learned and they failed every now and then at doing it correctly, it wouldn't negatively impact the overall transformation process that they have. And now they do more and more software as over the past couple of years, they've built up success with it. So it's always good in a large organization to set pacing expectations and very carefully pick the applications that you'll be doing over time. And I've just picked from a few large organizations the amount of applications they did first year. And I think a large part of this, it's important because many people, when they start off with wanting to change things, they start too big, and that often creates problems, because if you choose too large of a scope, as any developer or someone who's worked on software will know, you won't be able to achieve all of that scope, and you'll fail at it, and then that gets you a bad reputation, and you sort of revert back to the old way of doing things. So make sure to set your expectations correctly, and don't feel bad if you're not solving all of your organization's problems, even the big difficult problems in the first year or so. So then finally, the other thing that I see large organizations that I'll mention here doing is they do a tremendous amount of internal marketing and training and education in their organization. Now, it may be the case that you already do a lot of marketing internally and training, but chances are extremely high that organizations I've seen do. And every quarter, many of these organizations will have internal conferences, like Verizon does this, and several other organizations that I've worked with or that are documented, for example, in that Forrester report down there. And they'll go globally to their different organizations, and like this conference, they'll host it online and record it, but people will be in person to hear from each other, very importantly, to hear from other people in the organization, projects they've worked on, lessons learned, and even more detailed things like I'm going over here. So it's not only that they're doing, but they're building up trust in the rest of the organization and spreading out how that change is effective to other people in the organization. And then, of course, they do internal marketing beyond just like those sort of like monthly newsletters that people send out. And they're also building up this content internally to change over how people are doing things and to really educate. What's important for this is they actually, you actually allocate people and resources and the time of all of your staff, which may seem overwhelming, to attend these conferences, to do this internal training, and actually build up the skills and the knowledge of how they work from each other. And key to this, I think, is as kind of great out there, you can see myself and some of my coworkers helping out at one of these internal conferences. But you don't want to so much get external people like me, because at the end of the day, we just want you to buy the products that we have, so we don't have that much trust that we can give people. But if you're talking with each other internally, you should trust each other more, and you can kind of hone the exact steps that you've gone to how you actually work internally, and you can have a much better education process for what you're doing. So finally, if you're really interested in these kind of topics, we have an annual conference that we do up there in Washington, D.C. If you're interested in it, it's in September. And I would encourage you, if you're really interested in these topics, I've referenced many of them, but we have recorded session from these and other things from the community where I've basically stolen all this content from customers going over these tips. And but there's a little discount code there you can use. I think I get a really nice pin or something if I get enough people registered. So, you know, I always need pins. You should check out that conference. And also, I skipped over many things here to fit it into this time. But there's a free booklet that I have, a little PDF. I think it's about 49 pages. It's in English, fortunately, unfortunately, depending on what you like to read. I guess there's also a Chinese version, which I've never actually read. I'm not sure what's in it. But it goes over things in much more detail and covers things like finance and outsourcing and other items that I didn't have time to cover here. So with that, I always like to end with this quote from the Agile Manifesto, because I think it's what I've ended up focusing on, and what Pivotal and the team that I do there and so many other people focus on is figuring out better ways of doing software. And I think as you figure these things out, it's really good to pay attention to the last part, which is, you know, it's one thing to know on your own how to do things, but it's really valuable if you go out and, if only in your organization, help other people do it and talk about how you've improved things. So with a little bit of time left, I'm happy to take any questions that y'all have. But thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk about these topics.
Some questions. The first one is from la Universidad Tecnológica Nacional, and he asked about how do we have an effective teamwork?
Sure. Well, I think there's a few things, and this kind of gets to the difficulty of defining good culture. But one of the tactical things I would point at is think about that pairing that I mentioned. So there are some people who are grumpy about that. Probably be myself. I don't really like working with people directly. But what I've seen is that when people pair up, it's actually it's exciting for them because they're finally talking with a fellow programmer, for example, who is equally interested in programming. So it's not those awkward moments a lot of nerds have at parties where they don't really know what else to talk about except computers, or maybe that's just me. But you end up hanging out and working with someone who shares your own interest and probably is teaching you new things about programming, and you're also teaching them things. And so because you're working with this person each day, you very rapidly build up a rapport and you figure out teamwork with that one person. Now, this is also where the rotating part comes in, where if every day, at least every day, you work with someone else, you start to get to know someone else as well, and you further build up that camaraderie and that teamwork that you have. And so you can kind of extrapolate this out into weekly and monthly is you become friendly and very familiar with all these other people. And you also become more familiar with the system, the overall system that you're working on. And you really have that sense of all being on the team, and you're addressing those issues more. Now, also, things like internal training help out with that. And you often see that the development teams might end up working about 5 or 6 hours a day, right? Because you got to have lunch. And then they also encourage having just sort of, I guess, paid for relaxing time, right? Like for some reason, Pivotal people like to play ping pong or whatever, but they often consciously take out time as a team to go do things and relax because, you know, working 5 hours straight on development is pretty exhausting and you need to have some relaxing time. But really it is just interacting with people more that drives more teamwork, I think, among other things.
Also, we have the last one that we have time is from Jose Edmundo Martinez, that he asks, the pair programming is about two persons working in the same task or just having the other person next to us?
So usually, yes, it's the first. It's having people working on the same task. So from a developer perspective, I'm just going to choose some wacky thing. You might be improving the pagination system so that someone can type in the page number that they want to go to instead of clicking on the page number or those little less than or greater than signs. So that might be the task that the pair is assigned. And so assuming when they're getting to coding it, they would be generally, most of the time, they're looking at, now I open this piece of code and I'm going to add this feature. And now I open this part of the UI and I'm going to add this box. And so they're generally working with each other and saying like, oh, we should do it this way. And someone types it in, or we should do it this way, or let's test the same exact task that they're doing. Now, another set of times that they do is sometimes, especially if you're doing test-driven development, someone might be writing code and someone might be at the same time writing the test that they'll be running to test it out, right? And so in a very rapid way, they can kind of look at each other and talk with each other, or look at each other's work. I assume they also look at each other. And they know, like, for that code that's being written or that test that's being written, here's the way that I would code it. So you sometimes parallelize, if that's the way of saying it, the task that you're doing. And then other times, you might also have a situation where someone is kind of instructing, like, we should do this coding based on the design. Like if they're a more senior person, they might be teaching someone how to do something, which happens very frequently. And it's not only senior, right? Like a more junior person might know how something's working and they might tell the more senior person how to do it. So there's also that educating that goes back and forth. And then there's also sort of a, I don't know how frequently this happens, but sometimes you're also writing documentation for something as it's being coded, right? So especially if you are working on an API or something, you could imagine that someone, the pair is sort of constant talking with each other frequently. Someone might be writing the code, and in parallel, someone might be writing the documentation or the interface for it. And so you can start to see how this not only improves the knowledge that the team is sharing if you're rotating, and the quality of the software because you have two people thinking about it instead of just one, but it also starts to increase the productivity because you're doing these tasks in parallel that you have. And indeed, there's cases where people like Allstate, because of this, they find that productivity working about 30% of the time to about 90% of the time instead, and greatly increase the productivity that developers had by following pairing and other practices that I've talked about here.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's the end of the talk. Muchas gracias a todos por estar en esta sesión. Las sesiones que siguen a continuación son CMMI versión 2.0, más dinámico, ligero y adaptable, por Cecilia Montero. Integración continua con Docker y GitLab, por Isaac Daniel. Y Detonando la arquitectura del software con C4, por Rodrigo Rodríguez Negrete. Se pueden registrar las sesiones en SG Virtual. Y César, sí, las slides de Michael los vamos a subir igual a la página de SG. Y cuando estén todos listos, les va a llegar por correo la información de que ya pueden ser consultadas. Once again, thank you very much, Michael, for your time. It was a really, really good presentation. And see you in the next time. Muchas gracias a todos.
Sure.
Y nos seguimos viendo.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Gracias.
Thanks for having me. Gracias.